Hello, this is Andrew with $1,000,000 Bike, and this is the Rough Road 100 2022 race recap. The Rough Road 100 was supposed to be my first gravel race back in 2020. Obviously, global events happened, and so that didn't. But actually, let's take a step back. I just called Rough Road a gravel race, and that's certainly how the organizer characterizes it, and while that's kind of true, it's also kind of not true. There definitely are gravel sections, and the last 9-ish miles or so is a dirt path, a dirt canal path that runs along a river, which can be sketchy depending on weather conditions. But the mix is probably more like 60-40 road to gravel, which I think actually helps with approachability of the race. A lot of people are comfortable or more comfortable riding on the road than they are on gravel, and the gravel itself is not the kind of suck the soul from your body kind of gravel that you get out in Michigan when it's wet, or Iowa pretty much all the time. This was a very competitive event. It is the biggest race I've ever participated in, although here again, some explanation is warranted. It's actually several races all tied up into one event. I want to say that there were more than 800 people out there competing Saturday in all of the different races. One of those races is for USAC licensed people, like crit racers. That's not the one I did. That's not who I am. I was in the men's open. What that meant in practice was that there were a ton of people out there all riding their own race, and I wasn't competing against all of them. I was only competing in the open race. The race start was very interesting. Until I saw how it worked in practice, I wasn't a fan. But first, let's raise a glass, or a virtual glass, to the organizers, because they've clearly done this before. Everything went really, really smoothly. They managed everything so well. So, well done. So at the start, what they did is they lined up all of the different races into groups, with the USAC ladies first, then the USAC men, then the 100K Open, and the last bit was the 60K Open, with a neutral zone starting from the start line to the first stop light, which was then led to a right turn and up over an overpass. Obviously, some people didn't line up where they should have, but for the most part, it meant that the different groups didn't interfere with each other, so the start was sane, safe, and overall went very smoothly. No crazy dashes to the first turn, just lots of people moving slowly and safely. The first part of the race was fairly uneventful, at least from my perspective. Having ridden the course a few weeks ago, I expected it to be pretty tame until about 6 miles in. 6 miles in, there's a hill. Not a big hill, this is Illinois after all, but big enough that when we did the recon ride a couple weeks ago, it split the group hard. And not surprisingly, the same thing happened in the race. Fortunately, because we had done the ride before, I was prepared for that. The climb went about as well as I could have hoped. I quickly got near the front of the open group and into the back of the USAC men's pack. And here we can see where the group of USAC men that went on to win the race got away. That wasn't my race, so I didn't care. I just needed to stay near the front of my race, and so that's what I did. I was trying to be smart, watch for breaks, and riders who seemed to be out of their depth, and when a gap opened between where I was and the front, I'd cover it. The goal was to stay with the front group while doing as little work as possible. As long as I wasn't losing touch with that front set of guys, I was happy with that. It can be a somewhat risky game to play in some races, but Rough Road is mostly flat. So I was pretty confident that I could get away with it. I did almost get caught out around 9 miles in, but I saw the gap opening in time and just bridged across, no problem. That was a defining moment for a lot of riders because that's when we thinned the herd significantly. I was doing great. I was happy to hang out near the back and let them work for me. Then bad things happened. To be honest, even after watching the video over and over again, I'm not exactly sure what happened. The best I can do is guess that because I couldn't see the road very well in front of me, I didn't notice that there was a lot of gravel on top of the tarmac. So when I turned like I would on the road, because we were on pavement, I ended up on the ground. I suspect that this is the kind of thing where I could take that turn 1,000 times and only end up on the floor once. It just sucks that it happened when it mattered more than it would have otherwise. But that's something for the takeaway bag. After Snaggy Ridge, a friend of mine who is a member of the Church of Cinch sent me a podcast where Tom Danielson talks through the importance of mindset, among other things, in a race. How one should set goals, realistic goals, to win their race, because even though obviously you're competing against other people in a race, your main competitor is you. Even though I'm not a Tom Danielson believer, I find the mindset shift he describes to be an incredibly useful tool to manage and set expectations in a race. I'll include a link to in the description for those who want to have a listen. That might seem like a random aside, but in this moment, as I picked myself up, assessed the damage to myself and the bike, and I put the chain back on, all while watching the group ride away, applying those principles to reframe my race was incredibly powerful. The win I put in my head was catching back into that group. So I set off hard. I tried to catch back up. I caught some of the riders, then got swept into another group. It took 4.5 miles or so, but we eventually caught back up. At that time, I didn't think anything was really wrong. Sure, my hip and my elbow hurt, but it was easy to ignore the discomfort and do the work. The crosswinds were brutal. So we ended up doing a rotating pace line for the next 5 or 6 miles, which whittled the group down to 8, including me. And I probably went too deep during that period. Because when the adrenaline wore off and I couldn't ignore the fact that my left leg wasn't working right, I couldn't put out real power for any length of time and I got dropped. People in that group ended up on the podium. Looking at this graph, it's easy to see why. My left leg was phoning it in. You can actually see very clearly when the balance went from around 50-50 to a pretty strong right leg bias. I figured I'd make the most of it, I'd get aero, and crank the miles out. While the leg wasn't working right, it was still working, so I made finishing the new goal. Fortunately, I didn't have to go it alone. One of the guys who had also been dropped from that group caught up to me a few miles later, and we ended up riding mostly together for the rest of the race. There were periods where we would group with other riders, ride with them for a while, then drop them, or in the case of the last group we rode with, drop me, and then him. There were many times that I thought about quitting. Not the ride, don't want to be crazy. As long as I could turn the cranks, the ride was always getting finished. I mean the race. There really wasn't any need to keep pushing over the last few miles. But that's exactly what I did. I just kept digging. Get back on. It sucked. And ultimately, it wasn't enough. When in that last group, one of the guys attacked, the group amped up the pace to cover it. But even then, I kept going. And when the opportunity presented itself, I eventually caught back up to the guy I'd ridden with for most of the race. I knew I wasn't going to win any sprints, even with 2 working legs. So after catching him, I sat in for a while until there was about a mile to go, and then I went for it. I was trying to create separation. I just didn't have the legs, or I guess leg, for it. Needless to say, it wasn't enough, and I ended up losing the sprint across the line. As disappointing as the crash was, and the fact that my leg still isn't working right, I'm thrilled with the result. I ended up 11th out of 211 racers, and 2nd or 3rd, depending on how you count it, in my age group. With a podium that was 5 deep, had I not crashed, there was a decent chance I would have ended up on it. And yeah, let's take a moment to look at number 2 there. If that name seems really familiar, it should, because it was that Robbie Ventura. So what did I learn this time around? Well, the obvious thing is don't crash. But that's kind of cheating, because the real problem is likely to be a lack of familiarity with pack riding. I'm very comfortable in a single or double pace line, but I'm not so comfortable in that fluid position shifting, limited visibility, other considerations that come with riding in a cat herd. Other than that, I can't think of anything, which is somewhat disappointing because I'm sure there are other things, or would have been other things, to take away had I not spent some quality time adding scars to my leg. All in, I would still say that this was a great experience. And despite the uncomfortableness around what happened, it was a good way to stress test my mindset. Also, for what it's worth, if you live in the Chicago area, I would say that the Rough Road 100 or 60 is a great way to get a taste for racing, or if you just want to do it Fondo style, that's also an option. It's not that far from civilization, the course is mostly flat, and there are plenty of categories that should make it possible to find the right race for you. So I hope you found that useful. If you did, go ahead and like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. If you have any advice, things that I probably could have learned from this experience that I just wasn't clever enough to pop out, please drop those below as well. Thanks for watching. Cheers.